So now with Jefferson as president, right, there's going to be a number of policy changes that he is going to enact. Um, Very different mindset than John Adams, right? Jeffersonian politics can be referred to as, let me go ahead and put this up here so you can see for spelling, what we refer to as a laissez-faire approach in politics, which primarily translates to leave it alone, right? It's a French word, translates to leave it alone. And it means that it's a theory that's based on very minimal government intervention, right? It applies a lot in terms of economics, but Jefferson kind of used this as his overall idea of the federal government, right? He's still a big proponent of states' rights. So he really tried to do a lot in his policies to bring in as minimal federal government interference as possible. So when Jefferson comes into the presidency, right, he also goes ahead and chooses his cabinet members. The two main cabinet members that we're going to focus on, which really primarily played a role in forming Jeffersonian policy, was the fact that James Madison, right, was made Secretary of State, and Albert Gallatin was the new Secretary of the Treasury. Jefferson is going to have multiple numbers of attorney generals and secretaries of war and secretaries of the Navy throughout his presidency. So it's really no point in kind of going into all the list of names at this point. We're really just going to focus on James Madison and Gallatin as the two main cabinet members that are most influential. So Jefferson, from the get-go, is going to start to reduce the size of the government and the military, right? He does reduce the military size in the Army. He also reduces the Navy from what John Adams had expanded. He reduces it back to 7 ships instead of the large 30 that Adams had done. And one of the reasons that he's actually able to go ahead and implement all of these policies is because Congress, right, is now a Democratic Republican majority Congress. So it's all people from his party that are the majority in Congress. So he's able to get a lot of these enacts approved by Congress. So let me go ahead and make this larger now as we start to talk a little bit about the different things in Jeffersonian politics. So with the reduction of the federal government, not only the military, the Navy, at this point in time, the federal government itself, all of the employees were probably just a few hundred people in Washington, D.C., and Jefferson wanted to keep it that way. He really did not want to expand the amount of employees within the federal government. He wanted to find a way to reduce the taxes, these domestic taxes that were implemented before, like the whiskey tax, right? And so they were able to pass that and repeal the whiskey tax eventually. He also went ahead and wanted to allow the government to save more money in being able to repay the national debt through federal reductions, right, instead of taxing the people. He also changed voting rights in a sense that before you had to be a property owner in order to vote. Now this was thrown out, and they reduced the requirements to the fact that you could not have to be an ownership, right, property owner, and it opened up voting for a lot more citizens within the United States. Now, as we remember, right, Jefferson was a strict constructionist, and that is how he continued to view the powers of the federal government very literally as stated within the Constitution, though this is going to come into question when he decides to approve the Louisiana Purchase. And we're going to talk more about this later on in the chapter, but nowhere in the Constitution does it specifically talk about the government being able to acquisition new territory. And it's something that Jefferson does approve. So it is going to be a controversial subject with his strict constructionist view of the Constitution. Even though that does come into question, the Louisiana Purchase does allow us to double the size of the United States. And we do acquire a large portion of land now that allowed us to expand further. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the chapter. In terms of foreign policy, besides the Louisiana Purchase, right, Jefferson is going to do a lot to try and restrict our interactions with other countries, especially Britain and France, who continue to be at war with each other. So there's a lot of embargoes that come into play that Jefferson decides to embargo both Britain and France, though it does greatly damage our economy in the end, and his popularity does suffer because of that. Um, and we also do aid the rebellion that's happening on one of the islands in the Caribbean, the island of Saint Domingue, which was a French colony. Today is known as Haiti. So it was a slave rebellion occurring there. Napoleon, who at this time was now in power in France, because of the slave rebellion, because of his loss here in Saint Domingue, he decides to give up his role here in the Americas, and that's eventually what prompts him to offer us Louisiana, right? And we'll get to that later on in the chapter. Domestically, right, we talked about the fact that he wanted to reduce the amount of power and also the amount of money being put into the federal government. So cutting taxes and making those reductions in order to repay the national debt, that was his focus when it came to domestic policy. Even though he did reduce the military, he was able to start an academy to be able to produce soldiers. And he also did arm our ports with gunboats for our protections with our tradings. Because of the Louisiana Territory that was acquired, we also have the introduction of the Lewis and Clark expedition under Jefferson's presidency. And the Embargo Act of 1807, right, is one of the major acts that Jefferson passes. His hopes were that we would be able to rely on ourselves and be self-reliant to be able to produce whatever we wanted on our own and that be sufficient. But that was not really the case. And our economy really is going to greatly suffer from these embargoes that Jefferson decides to enact. And he's going to get a lot of enemies, not only from the Federalists already who opposed him as an opposing party, but now more merchants and businessmen are going to oppose Jefferson because their livelihoods are going to suffer because of these embargoes. Eventually, the Embargo Act of 1807 is going to be repealed in 1809 because of just the damage that it was doing to our country economically. So this is pretty much just a recap of Jeffersonian politics, right? We're going to touch upon each of these things more in detail throughout the chapter, but here we can kind of see overall what Jefferson's approach was to governing, right? And we mentioned it's that laissez-faire approach, the leave it alone approach, that he really wanted the federal government to not be involved in a lot of things. As much as possible, he reduced the federal government's presence in people's lives. And he also wanted to reduce our presence in the international stage as well, kind of making the United States what he hoped would become a self-reliant country that didn't need anyone else. But as we see over time, that was not the case. And trading was something that was necessary for the US to be able to move on. So I hope this kind of clears things up a little bit as an overview of what Jefferson kind of believed the way things worked in terms of governing. And we'll pick this up next time.